Here we are again, very pleasant autumn afternoon. Winter's just round the corner. You can hear the birds singing. Mr. Cat, the producer, is wandering around. He may grace us with his presence, but I doubt it. He's just too busy sunning himself. Now let's talk about three words: retain, repair, reinvest. What's that got to do with anything? Over the last 40 years, privatisation has been a significant ideology which has been pursued by local, state and the federal government here in Australia. And we've seen the privatisation of multiple scores of government-owned assets at bargain basement prices. I could list them. Things like the old Telecom, the Commonwealth Bank, Qantas, most of the energy producing facilities across the nation, public housing, and the list goes on and on. So what's retain, repair and reinvest? What's that slogan mean? Well, I'll take you through a particular struggle we're involved in currently through public housing, everybody's business, and then we'll expand it further out to this government's ideological agenda regarding privatisation. Because we're told that privatisation things, there's competition in the marketplace. With privatisation, prices will decrease, services will improve, and obviously people's day-to-day experience, whether it's with the privately owned telecommunications companies, privately owned essential services company, privately owned aged care services, privately owned early childhood development services, and the list goes on and on. Their personal experience is dramatically different to what's promised. So what has this got to do with us today? Well, currently, as I said before, we are involved in this struggle, public housing, everybody's business. We've been involved in a struggle regarding the privatisation of public housing in Victoria for over 6 years with marginal success. And it goes something like this. It's very simple. The Victorian State Government, the ALP government, brackets the Alternative Liberal Party, pursues a privatisation agenda regarding public housing, attempting to wash its hands of its responsibility to its citizens to provide a basic human necessity, shelter. Simple. And what it does this is through a propaganda exercise that Goebbels would be proud of. A propaganda exercise based on people thinking that public housing, that's housing which is publicly owned and publicly managed, is synonymous with these new terms: community housing, social housing, affordable housing, inclusive housing. And what it is currently doing, it is selling off estates, turfing out the residents and putting them in alternative accommodation, then giving over this land, public land, and some of it is in exceptionally good spots, especially in Melbourne, to the private sector. The private sector develops this land once the public tenants are evicted and their homes are demolished. And about 75 to 80% is a gift to the private developer because they've put in the money to develop the land. And about 20%, the remnants, and usually the areas which are not as well finished as the private sector developments, are then given across to the community, social, affordable, inclusive housing sector, which is privately owned and privately managed. It's a little bit like people trading in lifetime security, and that's what public housing gives you, lifetime security for private rental. Year-to-year lease, different set of conditions, cherry pick who goes into these places. No wonder we have increasing issues regarding homelessness and dislocation. So what's a retain, repair, reinvest philosophy? As I said before, currently, with the assistance of Margaret Kelly, who is one of the few remaining residents on the Barrack Beacon estate in Port Melbourne, which has been earmarked for redevelopment by the private sector, by the Victorian State Government. We have formed an association where she's resisting eviction, and we're bringing to attention the plight she finds herself in. As she says, it's not about me, it's not about Margaret Kelly, it's not about alternative accommodation. It's about being driven out of a place where I've lived at for over 2.5 decades in order for private developers to make some money, to divest the state government of its responsibility to provide housing. She said it's much more. And she's been asking for an appointment with the Minister for the last 1.5 years with no success, until we intervened on the 11th of May. And now the Minister of Housing, the Honourable Mr Colin Brooks, not that there's anything honourable about evicting people, but that's another story, has now agreed to a meeting, but only on the question of alternative accommodation for Margaret Kelly. Now Margaret Kelly has refused. She said, this is not about me, this is about changing your philosophy. It's about changing your philosophy regarding privatisation of public housing. It's about having a retain, repair, reinvest philosophy. And these three words can be used for any public facility which is up for privatisation, either at the federal level, state level, local level. Because what we've seen with the privatisation of various aspects of everyday living, what we've seen is a lack of competition in the marketplace. People think that competition occurs when you've got privately owned corporations and businesses competing against each other. That's not true. We've seen in Australia, especially where there are no divestment laws, in other words, any laws to stop companies getting bigger and bigger, we see 3 or 4 large corporations dominating every aspect of human existence. Take the question of housing, increasing rents, increasing mortgages, increasing homelessness. And this is directly attributable to the destruction of the public housing sector. Because a strong public housing sector introduces competition into the marketplace. The more people who live in public housing, the less people who need to rent privately. Rents decrease, prices decrease at the lower end of the market. This is the reality. You have real competition. It was the same when the Commonwealth Bank was privatised almost 30 years ago. What we saw is a lack of competition in the private sector. And the big four banks, the so-called big four banks, which have got government, permits to provide financial services, have been making a killing. Anybody who's got an account with one of the big fours, especially if it's some type of loan, whether it's a personal loan, a business loan, a mortgage, can see all the unnecessary fees and charges which are levied on their account because there's no competition. When the Commonwealth Bank was in public hands, there was competition because the Commonwealth Bank was owned and financed by the Australian people. Unfortunately, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are demonstrating to us, unfortunately, the Commonwealth Bank's ownership is not incorporated in the Australian Constitution. So any government could divest itself of any public institution at any time, irrespective of the services provided to the community, irrespective of the benefits, irrespective of how long it's been in existence. For example, the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, which was privatised in the mid-1990s by the Keating Labor government, another alternative Liberal party there, had been established in 1911 by a Labor Party to provide vaccines for Australians. And when it was privatised in the mid-1990s, when we were faced with the COVID-19 pandemic, when we didn't know what the mortality rate was, we didn't have any mechanism by which to identify it, we didn't actually have any vaccines, and we didn't actually have any treatment, we had no Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, so we are now relying on overseas corporations to provide the vaccinations at maximum profits for them. That's because there was no competition. It was the private sector providing a service. And it's the same with public housing. As you privatise public housing, there is no competition between state governments and the private sector. When Medibank Private was privatised by the Abbott-led Liberal National Party, we saw a huge increase in costs to consumers. While it was in public hands, those people who had private health insurance were able to contain their costs because they could put direct pressure on the government of the day. So what we are seeing is the destruction of the very fabric of this society, because what do public assets provide? They provide competition in a marketplace, in a private economy which is dominated by privately owned corporations. They provide services to people, to Australians, which are cross-subsidised. That means if you make a profit in one part of the organisation, that profit goes towards maybe providing services for a non-profitable part, but a necessary part. Not everything in life you can derive a profit. That's why you had the nationalisation. That's why you had publicly owned assets, because the private sector, whether it was finances, whether it was health, whether it was housing, whether it was security, could not provide the service. The other thing that happens when you have a publicly owned asset, not only does it provide services at a reasonable cost, it can also provide a profit. When Medibank Private was privatised, it was providing a profit of about $100 million to the government. When the Commonwealth Bank was privatised, it was providing a profit which would go into Treasury, which would help to augment taxation income, which puts downward pressure on prices. It's extraordinary how little interest there is in public facilities, especially public facilities that are incorporated, whose ownership is incorporated in the Australian Constitution, so they cannot be sold by the government of the day on an ideological whim. And what we've seen over the last 40 years is an ideologically driven campaign to give profitable public assets to the private sector at bargain basement prices. This brings me back to the Margaret Kelly struggle. On the 1st of June, which is a Thursday at midday, we'll be having a rally on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House to again push the state government to change its policies. Push the state government to have a discussion, the Housing Minister with Margaret Kelly, about policies, not where they want to relocate her. Policies based on retaining public housing. Policies based on repairing public housing. Policies based on reinvesting in the public housing sector, publicly owned, publicly managed housing, not investing in the private sector to provide what should be an essential public service. These three words, retain, repair, reinvest, can be used in any anti-privatisation struggle. Because whether you are in aged care, privatised aged care, whether you're using privatised early childhood development, whether you're using privatised aircrafts, a privatised Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, privatised private insurance companies, and the list goes on and on, privatised essential services, gas, oil, water, electricity, water, the list goes on and on. Ultimately, that corporation does not cross-subsidise. When push comes to shove, as we see in the aged care sector, the federal government, through our taxation, is now augmenting aged care workers' wages by 15% to the tune of $11 billion over the next 12 months. Because a privatised aged care sector cannot make a profit by looking after elderly people. It's been a total farce and disaster. The Royal Commission pointed out the farce it is. We see the same disease now infecting the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Although the National Disability Insurance Scheme is publicly owned, we are seeing privately owned corporations, privately owned businesses, fleecing residents who've got packages that are supposed to provide service for them, and we see 40% of those packages disappearing in fees and charges, and if they're lucky 60% is left for them. In some situations it's less than that. We see this in the community legal centres or public legal centres, which have been forced to partially privatise in order to exist, and the list goes on and on. So any struggle against governments trying, at the local, state and federal level, trying to privatise any public asset which provides essential services for human beings should be resisted. And it should be resisted using the retain, repair, reinvest slogan. And if new public utilities, public facilities are financed to provide essential services to the community, if we see the nationalisation of failed private enterprises, that ownership should be incorporated in the Australian Constitution, and that can be done very simply through a referendum which asks the Australian people whether they want to incorporate the ownership of any public facility at the federal level within the Australian Constitution for time immemorial. Think about it. We don't have to march to the beat of their drum. We don't have to dance to their tunes. We don't have to accept what they say is a fait accompli and resistance is useless. Ultimately, power in any society is based, in a democratic society, is based on the people. It's not based in the hands of the government of the day. It's not based in the hands of the disciplinary arm of the state, the police and armed forces. It's not based in the bureaucracy. It's not based in the corporate sector. It is not based in the parliament, but ultimately democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people, is based in the hands of the people. And we need to understand that it's us, you and me, that are the only thing that stand in the way of whatever public resources are left from being privatised, and which stand in the way of this bankrupt ideology continuing to overrun the people of this country. If we're not willing to resist, we deserve the consequences. And currently, unfortunately, because most of us accepted that privatisation was the way forward, didn't ask any questions, decades later, we are all paying the price for the privatisation mania.